So welcome to everybody from far and wide who is taking the time to join this webinar this morning. My name is Ingrid Liepa and I will be the moderator for this session. So today we're very fortunate in bringing together two organizations, Living Lakes Canada and Selkirk Innovates at Selkirk College, and 4 experts in different fields to help us all wrap our heads around the opportunities and challenges of local data for local climate action. And before proceeding, I'd like to ask everyone just to take a quiet moment to fully feel your feet on the ground and pause. Pause to connect and reflect on the lands we find ourselves on and the peoples who have inhabited these lands since time immemorial. The Columbia Basin region comprises the traditional and unceded territories of the Kootenai, the Kootenai, the Secwepemc, the Sinixt, and the Silks nations. This region is also home to 6 Métis Nation BC chartered communities. We are deeply grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and meet here today, and to keep moving forward with open hearts and minds as we walk together to forge the paths of reconciliation and healing. So, as you can see from our agenda, we'll be looking more closely at the Columbia Basin's 2 online data solutions via a short tour of each platform. Then we'll be situating ourselves with a better understanding of each of our panelists' work and frame of reference before we dive into a panel discussion that's going to be centered on key questions around local data for local climate action. And the final segment will be an opportunity for you to ask your questions of the panelists and presenters. Our hope is that our time together this morning will contribute to greater awareness of data needs, the tools available, and how we can work together for watershed security, the health of the water-based ecosystems that support us, and for climate resilience. So just a couple of housekeeping items. I think we're all pretty pro at Zoom webinars now. So everything on this slide should feel a little bit like a well-worn shoe. We have lots of people joining us, so take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're coming from and your field of work. We ask that you stay muted during the presentations. Use the chat for any questions or comments. Speaker view, we're going to encourage you to use that speaker view because it's always a little bit more immersive than looking at 30 little boxes. And just to let you know, this event is being recorded and we'll be sending the recording within a few weeks. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to invite our first presenter, Lauren Retheritt from Selkirk Innovates, to take us on a tour of the Columbia Basin climate source.
Hi, everyone. As Ingrid said, my name is Lauren Retheritt. I am joining you from Nelson today. I work at Selkirk Innovates at Selkirk College, and I'm going to give you a quick tour of Columbia Basin climate source. So the site was introduced in 2019, and it had emerged from Columbia Basin Trust's climate action program, and the program staff had been sort of traveling around different communities around the basin and presenting great presentations full of local climate data, and there was really demand of those presentations for that to be shared out to the communities. And so at that time, the trust approached Selkirk Innovates and they asked for our help to develop the site. And so we've been in partnership with them ever since to make this happen. So I'm going to give you a quick tour. The heart of the site is really climate data projections for over 40 climate indicators. And so I'm just going to click through on mean annual temperature today, but you can explore different future scenarios, different emission scenarios and how they impact the data. You can look at through different time periods and how those are going to change over time. And then you can look through different model ranges, and the data that's on the site here is an ensemble of 7 models that have been specially selected for the geography in our region. So it's really fine-tuned to our place here. You can click anywhere on the map to access the data for that 10 by 10 kilometer square, and you can also download the data either in spatial format for analysis in GIS applications or in tabular format for analysis in something like Microsoft Excel. you can download a summary of that climate data for any community in the region and some select high elevation sites as well. These community profiles, yeah, include a summary of the data, and they also include great examples of local climate action, as well as a summary of some of the key climate impacts that we're experiencing in the region and what you can do to help address them. One important note there is that while the data on the website, on the site itself has been updated to the latest and greatest climate data that was just introduced a couple months ago, the stuff that's in the community profiles is still in the process of being updating. So check back in a couple months and for some new great community profiles. There's this impact section where you can explore the local impacts of climate change through various themes. So this one is nature. As you scroll through, different map layers will show up that help to explain some of the concepts that are talked about. And so you can explore, for example, how glaciers have changed from 1984 to 2021, which is a really powerful example of how water cycles in our region are shifting. Unfortunately, just this morning, this part of the website kind of crashed, and anybody who knows who runs a website knows that happens a lot. So that should be up by the end of the day. There is a database of local climate actions, and this is another piece that's in the process of being updated. We have this great new list of climate action that we're going to put up here within the next month or so. And so, yeah, lots of great examples, and that you can click through and see how your neighbors are helping to address the climate change issues in your region. And then there is also a series of 2 to 3 minute climate science videos. So if you find yourself in a position of wanting to kind of get up to speed on how to make sense of how to use and interpret the data that you're finding on the site, this is the place to do it. So we've got our friend Mel Reisner, who many of you might know, who's here to talk you through some of the core climate science concepts. These are great little introductory videos. I think that's all I wanted to cover today. So back to you, Ingrid.
All right, thanks, Lauren. And maybe you could put the link to the Basin Climate Source in the chat for anybody.
basinclimatesource.ca.
Yeah. And so next up, I'd like to welcome Maggie Finkel-O'Coin to take us through the Columbia Basin Water Hub.
Thank you, Ingrid. Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie. I am the GIS and Database Coordinator for Living Lakes Canada. Living Lakes Canada is a multi-award-winning NGO that facilitates collaboration and monitoring, restoration, and policy development initiatives for the long-term protection of Canada's lakes, rivers, wetlands, and watersheds. We are leaders in the realm of community-based water monitoring, having led water stewardship initiatives for nearly 2 decades. The creation of the Columbia Basin Water Hub was motivated by a 2017 report written by Dr. Martin Carver, which resulted in a conference hosted by Living Lakes Canada focused on water data in the Columbia Basin, which concluded that there was a need for the development of a coordinated water monitoring network, as well as a central place to store and access water data that was being collected. This led to LLC to develop the Columbia Basin Water Hub, a central place where decision makers can access a wide variety of data and information about water in the Columbia Basin. The Water Hub also serves as a long-term archive of this information to ensure it is not lost with time. The goal of the Columbia Basin Water Monitoring Framework is to establish a unified monitoring network based on selection criteria that reflects local priorities and within a scientific water balance approach. This collaborative approach, facilitated by Living Lakes Canada, will support the tracking and understanding of the implications of climate change on water supply for the basin's ecosystems and people. In 2022, this comprehensive approach to water monitoring was piloted in 3 subregions of the Columbia Basin, with the goal to scale and expand this model across the entire basin region and to serve as a template for other regions. The resulting data will be available on the Water Hub in 2023. So with that little introduction, I'm going to throw the link for the hub into the chat. Please feel free to follow along, or you can bookmark this link for later. And I'll share my screen here. Okay, So here we are on the landing page of the Columbia Basin Water Hub. Right away, you can see that we have multiple options to start exploring our data. So we're going to go ahead and click on data sets. We have 238 data sets available to view. You can filter these results based on keywords, organizations, file formats, licenses, and groups. Today, we're going to take a look at the Mcdonald Creek Hydrometric Station, which is run by a Living Lakes Canada program, the Kootenai Watershed Science. Here in the data set, we have metadata available immediately. So this gives you a sense of the project itself. So we have funding descriptions, the location, and other relevant data to the project. We can then go ahead and click into one of our resources. So the resources is the file itself. Already got loaded here because it's quite large. We come in here and we can see that we have a data previewer. So we're able to give our users a sense of what they're about to download before they do so. We also have some graphing functions here for our users. So you can go date, time. Let's take a look at discharge. And it's already graphing out that data. We've received a lot of feedback from our users that this is a powerful tool. Down here, we have more metadata. This gives you an idea of what kind of information is held within the file, how that data was collected, how it was processed, and the grade, the water hub grade. We recommend that all of our users look into the metadata, ensure that the quality that the data has been rated as is appropriate for their uses. We are able to hold all sorts of data types. Here alone, you can see that we have Excel, PDF, we have a link, and we're also able to host things like JPEGs, audio files, reports, any number of files. We're able to facilitate that storage for you. Another method that we're able to search through this data is organizations. We have 45 organizations or contributors that work with us, and we're able to host that data for them. Coming in here gives you a quick little blurb about the organization themselves, as well as all their data that you can then further filter based again on those filters I mentioned earlier. Coming into map search, this is the final way we can start to search through this data, and it gives you an idea spatially of what you're looking at through the Columbia Basin. It's going to take a moment here to load, but when it does, here we are, we're able to filter by water body type. You click here, and it gives you a good overview of what the data set looks like, and it will link you back to that page. We have more information on our About and Help page. We are always interested in having user feedback. Please don't ever hesitate to reach out if you are wanting to contribute data, or if you're looking at potentially finding a piece of data, we're more than happy to help. And with that, I will pass it over to Ingrid.
All right, thanks, Maggie, and thanks for putting the link in the chat. Lots to dig in there. So we're going to switch gears now, and we're going to hear from our panelists. And so I'm going to be introducing each of them in turn. We're going to begin with a local government perspective with Paris Marshall-Smith. And she joined the Regional District of Central Kootenai in 2017 to work on energy, water, food, and agriculture and climate action. She's a registered planner with a background in systems change and is particularly interested in changing how we create and sustain the colonial conditions that displace, erase, and inflict violence. She has a master's in community and regional planning and Master of Science in agricultural economics. Based in Nelson, she's lived in the Kootenays for 10 years and is slowly making her way around Kootenai Lake, a favorite for swimming and watching trees. Paris.
Thanks, Ingrid. And thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here today and to see so many familiar faces as I'm scrolling through chat and seeing your introductions. So thank you very much. As Ingrid mentioned, I'm the sustainability planner for the Regional District of Central Kootenai. And largely my role, while it focuses in those various areas, is to investigate questions, host conversations, and to explore and develop ideas either into projects or programs that are beyond the operations of the RDCK, with specific focus to sustainability and climate action. My current work includes watershed governance, climate action, grid resilience for rural communities, an investigation of deep geothermal potential, and strategizing for regional active and low carbon transportation, and anti-racism and intercultural training for our organization. We were asked a few questions to support our introduction. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we use water and climate data in our work. And we both generate and use water and climate data to plan, make decisions, and support our internal, or what we call corporate action, and also support our work with community residents. And there's two projects specifically that I'd like to talk about. One is our Watershed Governance Initiative, which began about 2 years ago in response to our growing understanding that drinking water systems, particularly for residents and watershed health, are increasingly vulnerable across the region. We have limited jurisdiction as a local government, and so the WGI, as we call the Watershed Governance Initiative, is really focused on creating conditions for collaborative decision making, with the hope that if we are able to come together with a broader understanding of value and worth, then our decisions will be different. And we will be able to influence decisions to be different. And this creating conditions is a very amorphous and really an active edge of learning for us. But we're currently doing it through relationship building with First Nations, community stewardship groups, and providing good data to support community-led planning and engagement. And I'm going to share 2 examples or some slides of work that we've currently done to support that access to information and access to support decision making. Just let me know if the screen doesn't show. So this is one tool that we created last year as part of an initiative to boldly set what we're calling democratize information. And this is a web map of as much information as we are able to access on watersheds. And we've been working this year to refine it. Last year was sort of the big dump. And this year we've been refining it and trying to make it more user-friendly. And for those that are on the call, you may have seen a survey go out to you to say, have you used this tool? And if not, please tell us why. And if you are using it, please let us know how you are using it. And so you can see on the right, this is just a screenshot, but you can see on the right-hand corner that there's a variety of layers that can be toggled on and off. And this is just a screen capture of some of the creeks that, or the creeks that are part of the arm along Kootenai Lake. And then as well, building on this, and again, I just reference a lot of the folks that are on this call because many of you participated in sharing your stories with us of how you are building and working to support watershed protection in your community and the protection of your drinking water. And so we created what are called story maps to highlight how communities are working in their community. And this is again just a screenshot from the story map page, but you can see across the top that some of the ways that we've started to organize our data and even recognizing the importance of data, and a lot of the information that's in this in these story maps is drawn from the Water Data Hub. And if you're not familiar with either the WGI web map or the WGI story maps, we'll put them, they'll be included, the links will be included in the mail that comes out with the recording of this webinar. So yeah, just to go back to those 2 pieces, so the story map and the web map, and what we're currently doing is, as I said, refining those 2 pieces, and then also looking at how we can broaden the definition of what is data, and taking a more active approach into watershed governance by doing a cumulative impact study in Duck Creek, which is a watershed in Yakinuki, Amakas, or Creston Valley. And so part of the storytelling, whether by us or by residents of the watershed, requires good data. And we see, as I said, we see our role is in making that data accessible and challenging conventional definition of what data is. Another area.
I'm just going to say you're actually after 5 minutes.
Okay, great.
That's 5.
That's perfect. So I'll save my other example for later. I didn't think I was going to go over 5, but yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Ingrid.
All right, thanks, Paris. And yeah, I mean, just given where we are with the rapidly changing climate, you know, that democratization of data and making it available is super powerful. So thank you for sharing that work with us. All right. On next, with giving us an Indigenous perspective is Mark Thomas. He's a Shuswap band member and holds the title of Salmon Chief for his community. He currently sits on the council for the Shuswap Band and manages the portfolios for aquatics, fish, housing, BC Hydro, and forestry. Mark is educated in and has worked in the natural resource management field for over 20 years and attended Nicola Valley Institute of Technology and the University of Lethbridge. A highlight of Mark's interest is the advocation for salmon restoration in the Columbia River. Mark currently sits as the chair on the Columbia River Salmon Reintroduction Initiative Executive Working Group, and he participates at the Columbia River Treaty Negotiating Advisories team with the three nations, Canada and BC. So welcome, Mark.
Like this right up, Rensquens, Kamipala, Mark Thomas. Good morning, everybody. I'm honored to address you this morning on water quality and water availability, as well as climate change and how that affects our work. As was just mentioned, I am a counselor for Shuswap Band. I also sit at the Columbia River Treaty as the technical lead for my nation in ecosystem function works, as well as at the CRISRI, or Columbia River Salmon Recovery Initiative, as the executive working group chairperson. Climate and water quality is huge to all the work that I do. As many people know, salmon this year have faced some quite significant challenges, particularly around water availability. And if anybody's watched the news in the last week, you can see some of those impacts firsthand through those news broadcasts. And it's been very, very saddening to see thousands upon thousands of fish, not making their way to their natal grounds and succumbing to the lack of water and our global warming impacts that are happening firsthand. We do a lot of efforts, a lot of work to try and create salmon awareness, to create habitat, to allow people to understand what salmon require in terms of restoration in the Upper Columbia. And this is, when climate change shows its face like it did this year, all of those things are unraveled. And so it's difficult to continue to try and focus in on some of the things like water availability when we're faced with such uncertainties on that availability itself. Water historical record is very important to us, but it does not very often demonstrate what we're seeing in these days and times. So how do we really rely upon that is questionable. I was intending to answer some questions, and I apologize to the group here. I'm just going to stop here with my intro and allow for those questions to be posed earlier so that I don't repeat myself too much. But I am very, very happy to be here. And one thing I want to mention about Cursory is that it is actually a 5 government initiative that brings in Canada and BC for the first time into salmon restoration with the 3 Indigenous governments. Some of you might recall CRIFIC, or Canadian Columbia River Intertribal Fisheries Commission, which had the prime mandate of restoring salmon in the Columbia River. It was very, very well intended, but had 0 traction. Unfortunately, it was not acknowledged by those other 2 governments, Canada and BC. And if it was not resourced or given enough credence to make it to make it in motion. And so what I like to call a perfect storm is reconciliation, UNDRIP, the finding of 215 children at the Kamloops, CRT, and probably a couple other factors that culminated together to make what I call the perfect storm. And so that we can now address things like salmon restoration and come together in a broader light. Another thing I'd like to mention about salmon restoration in Cursory is it's based on a 3-year commitment. And if anybody knows the life cycle of a salmon, you can say that it's more than 3 years. So we need to come together to make sure that we are in fact committing to longer than those 3 years, that we have commitment not only financially, but a commitment as well through government and others. And at some point, BFO will have to come in, because we do have salmon in our waters now through USA efforts of studies and some of the FINS program that the Okanagan Nation has been supporting, and that's basically fish in schools. And so some of those releases, as well as ceremonial, have resulted in salmon in our Canadian waters. And so that's a very exciting time to be Indigenous. It's a very exciting time to be a Columbia Basin resident, and I look forward to the future. Duksham.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Deep appreciation for the work that you and your nation and other nations are doing on the salmon restoration, and look forward to the question period. So before that, we have a couple more presenters. We have next on John Cathero. And John has 25 years experience working within complex multi-party resource use situations, and his approach is based on collaboration and capacity building while being grounded in technical expertise. John is an independent consultant whose clients include First Nations, communities, companies, organizations, and governments across BC and around the world. He works on issues that include community wildfire risk reduction, ecosystem restoration, strategic land use planning, and conservation area design. John has graduate degrees in forestry and land use from Oxford University and conflict analysis and management from Royal Roads University. John, welcome you to this webinar.
Thank you, Ingrid, for the introduction, and thank you for the organizers. I think this is a really important webinar. This subject is really, really important. I'm happy to be part of it. I'm going to just put a couple of slides up to frame some of the points that I'm going to make, and definitely try to keep within my 2-minute or 5-minute time slot. While I'm pulling this up, can you guys see that okay? I really appreciate the opening comments so far, and Paris from a local government perspective, and Mark from a Shuswap perspective. I think it just speaks to the scope of the issue that we're talking about. I'm going to zoom in a little bit and take a look at the water data from the perspective of climate change, and one of the impacts that we all see from climate change, which is wildfire, and the impacts on water security, and in particular, water that is used for everything from agriculture, domestic use, but as we know, water is also habitat. Water is essential for salmon restoration, for cultural uses, for recreation uses. I don't need to explain that to the people on this call. I'm gonna focus on sort of the West Kootenays, Kootenai Lake, RDCK. It's where I do a lot of my work. If we look at where we get our water, and here in the West Kootenays, within the RDCK, there's 18 different irrigation districts run by the RDCK. There's a bunch of other ones that are not run by the RDCK, run by neighborhood groups and so on and so forth. There's at least 9 municipal systems, some of them very complex, some of them very old. There's 4 different hydropower utilities within within the RDCK, stretching all the way down to Trail. There's just within the Creston Valley, there's 100 kilometers of flood control dikes, which span at least a half a dozen different jurisdictions, from federal Indian Reserve land to irrigation districts. And there's at least 4,500 private water licenses who draw water from creeks, springs, sometimes wells, and the odd bit being drawn out of the lake or lakes. So right off the bat, a very complex amount of jurisdictions, individual managers, all of this stuff. Let's zoom in and take a look at what can happen within the system. This is a map of the Cathero watershed, Kemp Creek. Cathero is in the upper right-hand corner. And if you see, there's a bit of a pink line. There was a wildfire in 2007, there was a wildfire. 20% of the watershed was burned, damaged to the point that the vegetation was almost completely removed. It was quite a high intensity fire. In 2012, 5 years later, floods destroyed the infrastructure. So they replaced the infrastructure. In 2020, floods destroyed the infrastructure again, and they replaced the infrastructure. And of course, I'm waiting to hear Herb's presentation, but it's pretty clear that if you don't address watershed restoration, simply replacing the plumbing is not going to do much. And I bring this up to point out just how fragile our infrastructure can be. And then finally, just to put a sharper perspective on wildfire, it of course happens when there are water restrictions in place. This happens in pretty well every community that I know of. From you're not allowed to water your garden, you're not allowed to wash your car, depending on the stage of water restrictions. And we really lack the ability to store water, not just within the watershed, but within infrastructure, so that we have water when we need it. And not just for suppression, but for all of the other uses of water as well. One final example. Sorry about my throat. My kids are bringing stuff home from school. Of the 18 systems the RDCK manages, the closest one to my house is Woodbury, just down the lake. It is a huge tank, like 30 feet by 12 feet. It holds 60,000 gallons. If people start putting sprinklers up in their yard to increase relative humidity from a wildfire perspective, we can burn through 1,000 gallons in an hour with a very small number. That's before we have watershed damage or damage in the watershed from wildfire. That's just the risk to our infrastructure. I am going to talk about some of the solutions and how this links back to some of the data we have. But for now, I'll leave it there and look forward to the other presentations.
All right, thanks, John. And you can already see, by putting such a fine lens on the kind of data we need to really understand where we are with our water reality. I look forward to, the question period with you. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce Herb Hammond, and our final panelist. He's a forest ecologist and retired registered professional forester with 40 years of experience in research, industry, teaching, and consulting. He is best known for his concept and application of nature-directed stewardship, which he formerly referred to as ecosystem-based conservation planning. Working primarily with Indigenous nations and other rural communities, Herb has developed more than 25 ecosystem-based conservation plans across Canada and other parts of the world. Herb holds a Bachelor of Science in Forest Science from Oregon State University and a Master's of Forestry in Forest Ecology and Silviculture from the University of Washington. Happy to have you here today, Herb.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Ingrid, for that introduction. And I've enjoyed the other three presentations. I'm going to take a slightly different tact in my presentation to kind of focus a little bit more on water. And in answer to John's good idea about having storage tanks, for the last 4 years, I've had a 1,200 gallon storage tank that I fill every year next to my log house, so that if things get dire, I have a way of dealing with them. I want to start by saying that I'm looking out my window at what's left of the Little Spokane River. And by what's left of the Little Spokane River, I mean the effects of drought and the effects of 70 years of clear-cut logging in the watershed. So we need to change that relationship with water if we're going to survive and adapt to climate change. And I think that the data and the climate framework that we're talking about today are good starts to that. So I'm going to share my screen here, which I hope you can see. Everyone see that? How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, as I said, I want to start with water. And to me, water starts from my heart. I've learned, I apply that in my planning. I certainly owe a huge debt of thanks to the many indigenous people from Nitassinan or the Innu in Labrador and Newfoundland to the Haida and Haida Gwaii and many, many other nations in between for teaching me that fundamental truth. And I think it's a really important part of data. I think we need to approach data, not just from the left side of our brain, but from the right side of our brain. So I encourage you to start there. Hear your heart, like the soft, nourishing sound of water dripping through a forest canopy. Water is also well understood to be the connector. We could think about it as Earth's veins and arteries. And it's everywhere at every scale and every time. If you look at the spider's web, you can see that you can take out a few of the pieces of it. You can take out some of the cross parts of the web, but if you get to a point where you take out too many, it collapses. And then that reminds us that ecosystems that we all, like the ones we all live in, are a living fabric woven together by water. In that sense, what water is literally everywhere. So the other thing to know about water is that it's alive. If water is not alive, then we're not alive, because we're 70% water or more, slightly more, or we're not here. So we need, just like starting from our hearts, we need to recognize that water is not just a commodity. It's not just a product of ecosystems, but it's a living part of that system. So what goes along with that is that water may either transmit the essence of life or magnify and transmit our mistakes. Unfortunately, the latter is our relationship with water oftentimes shows up with those mistakes. And we're in the midst of the largest mistake that people have ever made, called climate change and the biodiversity crisis that accompany it. So I really encourage you to think about that when you start designing or thinking about carrying out activities in watersheds. So what I work on right now are what I call nature-directed plans, and those plans follow a path to a new relationship, one that puts water first, and that those plans are regenerative as opposed to exploitive and extractive. They're respectful. They're respectful of all beings, all our relations, as Indigenous people point out to us in the systems. We also need to recognize gratitude for what comes from the lands and the waters where we live. But along with that, we need to give back. We need a reciprocal relationship with nature to affect really sustainable plans that protect water. And
Herb, you're at 5 minutes, just
okay.
letting you know.
All right, I will just finish it off here with this last slide. This is an example of the kind of plans that we're talking about. And I'll put the link to these plans in the chat. Thanks.
Super, thank you so much, and hopefully be able to sort of continue to explore those themes. I think, you know, you said it very well in terms of changing our relationship with water to survive and adapt to climate change is something that's absolutely essential, and you know, it really begins with hearing our hearts and through our hearts. So yeah, thank you. So thank you all panelists. We're going to move into a bit of a panel discussion. We have a series of questions that we're going to pose, and the format is going to be, we're going to ask a question of one of our panelists. They'll have 2 minutes to respond. And if there's any of the other panelists that want to add a different perspective or additional information, you know, they'll have a minute to add as well. So I'd like to begin with Mark. And our first question is a really foundational question of like, how do you use water and climate data in your work?
Yes, thank you, Ingrid. That's an excellent question, and somewhat of a loaded question because we use it quite significantly. Salmon restoration is a key focus of my work, as I explained earlier, and historical data is what is used to make inferences on management scenarios and modeling exercises. It's currently what we're doing right now in the CRT level is modeling some of those different values from perspectives all the way from cultural values all the way to social values like recreation and things like that. The climate of today is difficult to model because much of the climate is unlike historical record, which we use to make inferences upon and to make those models work. At the CRT, climate and water data are key to making inferences for potential water planning exercises and to better understand through record what impacts may have been considered through a similar water year. But like I said, it's not exactly specific or exact science. It's difficult to make those inferences when we're having climate events that have never been on record before. And so it does make it difficult. At the community level, water is important for our social needs and for economic needs, as we, as Shuswap Band, have a water and sewer system that services on and off reserve. Projection of flows and aquifer levels are key to understanding the limitations and the potential of our system. That's in a nutshell what I use water quality and data for, and for climate data, as well as there's some other inferences too around some of the work that we're doing around the creeks and trying to restore habitat in the name of sturgeon and cutthroat trout right now. And so a lot of what is projected or is on historical record is going to be what we use to understand the impacts to those creeks up to date and what we can do to those creeks or those tributaries to better them for those two species that I just spoke of, and ultimately for salmon when we were able to recover them in the Upper Columbia. So thanks.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Do any of our other panelists want to offer a different perspective on using water and climate data in your work? Yeah, Paris.
Thank you. Yeah, just to add, the second example that I started to introduce in the introduction is around climate action. And so we developed a climate action strategy in 2019 in response to a climate action imperative declared by the board. And that strategy is 3 parts. So it's inform, guide, and take action. And the inform is really about having good data. And we see that as not only generating our own data and making sure that we are monitoring ourselves well and being transparent in that data, but also using the data sources that are available. And yeah, the Basin Climate Source is an excellent source of data. We had to, for our forthcoming RDCK climate actions, which is our climate action plan, we had to go to PCIC because we don't, the climate source doesn't provide regional data, but it is an excellent community-based data source. And PCIC is an acronym for the Pacific Consortium on Pacific Climate Institute Consortium, PCIC. But yeah, so those two sources of us both generating and then also using good data. And I just want to recognize what has been mentioned about data is also through experience and on the ground information, and that is also part of the data that we use is stories and those that have lived experience. Thank you.
All right. So we're going to keep building on that with the next question. And that's actually for you, Paris. And, what are the critical areas of planning and decision making in your field of local government that benefit from the access to credible local climate and water data?
Thanks, Ingrid. Yeah, so beyond the work that we're doing through the Watershed Governance Initiative and our climate action work, other areas for the RDCK include land use planning as a critical area for good data. And often, and one example is a recent change by the Agricultural Land Commission to increase permissibility or increase the number of dwellings on the agricultural land reserve. And this came into sharp focus for the Creston Valley, which is, as many of you know, already experiencing water scarcity, and particularly 2021, where there was significant experiences of drought by many of the water systems. And so in trying to understand at a government level how to navigate this new direction by the province, we went to community, and the planners went to the farmers and also went to Yakanuki as those that hold that long perspective of water and that long understanding of what is the situation of water as a way of understanding, can we actually do this? And the response was that there isn't sufficient, first of all, there isn't sufficient understanding of the water situation in Creston, but based on experience, there isn't sufficient water to support a blanket enactment of this. And so we employed the precautionary principle and did prioritize water and to not enable increased density in that case. Am I at 2 minutes? No.
You've got 30 seconds.
Perfect. So two other examples are water systems, which was already alluded to by John, and then also emergency planning and management. We also need good data there as well. Thank you.
Right. Does anybody else want to talk about how, the access to credible local climate and water data where that's critical for the work you do? Or should we move on to the next question? Is that Herb? Are you?
Thanks, Ferris. That was a good explanation. I just want to emphasize a couple of things in general that I take from what you've explained, and that's that we need to focus on collecting the right data. It's not collecting all the data; it's collecting the data that meets your needs, and that starts with understanding the problem. And sometimes we're also not very good about that, but I won't get into that at the moment. And then we need to use that data. It can't just sit on the shelf somewhere. It needs to be applied. And that means that people that are interested in adaptation to climate change, conserving water, et cetera, need to be proactive in using that data to change how we use land, to change what developers do on the land. So I just like to add that to support what Paris put forth.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, because data's not going to help us if we just leave it on the shelf. That is for sure. John, Mark, any further thoughts, or should we move on to the next question?
I'll make a quick comment on that as well. It's a little bit separate from what you guys are discussing, but it's just as applicable, I think. And it's the challenges of what we have in terms of needs of BC on their needs for electricity and hydro, and how we balance those other values. So those are critical aspects to water availability, to climate, to snowpack, to all those things that we use to make those inferences. So those are some very important aspects that we need to understand. Otherwise, we will be making the wrong inferences. Fortunately, we do use terminology like adaptive management that does allow us to learn while doing, which is an Indigenous concept, I think, at the root of it. But, you know, I do think that, you know, those challenges of what are the needs of BC people and what the other values are in terms of what they be environmental, cultural, or other, how they balance out are important. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, asking the right questions. Which brings us to the next question for John. And you know, looking at your work in community wildfire risk reduction, what are the challenges that you've been experiencing in accessing the data you need?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think as we've been discussing, there's actually a lot of great opportunities to access the data. We've learned from Lauren about the work that Selkirk's doing. Maggie told us about the water hub. In doing the sort of planning that Herb is doing, it integrates a lot of those data sources. The water monitoring program that is being done at high elevation, and the work that the regional district is doing. Like I think we do have great access to increasingly robust data. And what's interesting is a lot of it is citizen science or local organization generated. We just can't rely on the federal government or the provincial government to do a lot of this stuff. And it's often volunteer organizations, stewardship societies, local groups, Indigenous communities who bring this together and organize webinars like this. I don't want to make it sound like my lens is just watersheds, or sorry, wildfire. Wildfires come up from a climate perspective. But I think Herb's point is what are we going to do about it? I'm not a fish biologist, but I would posit to this group that if we wanted to address a lot of the issues we have with water, with quantity, quality, timing of flow, if we all focused on salmon restoration and did everything we needed to do to bring salmon back, then we would have sufficient ecosystem function to do a lot of the other things that we're talking about, including fire suppression. And I think we need to look at it, you know, through that lens, that how we grow our food is not separate from how we treat our big water systems and the species that live within it.
All right. Anybody else want to weigh in? Thanks, John.
Well, I would also amplify what John said about salmon. They're a keystone species, and they reflect what's going on in the whole landscape. So if salmon are healthy, the landscape is healthy, the watershed is healthy. So I think we need to look at aquatic systems in general to realize that they reflect what's going on in the watershed. Salmon in particular, but also many other organisms, as well as the actual characteristics of the creek in terms of quality, quantity, and timing of flow. But that data requires a lot of time to collect, to get a robust data system. And before that occurs, though, we have to use the precautionary principle in how we treat those watersheds. And we've done a very poor job of doing that by and large through the years.
I'll just add to that from an Indigenous perspective, salmon is one of the key focuses of the Columbia River restoration on any project. And when I spoke of cutthroat and sturgeon being used as a species to access funding for creek restoration and such, that was used strategically. Those two species were used strategically to understand better, or to transfer that knowledge, I guess is a better term, transfer that knowledge to salmon ultimately. and what the availability is for salmon in terms of connectivity, in terms of habitat availability and things like that. And to complement what Herb had just said, you know, when you break them out into tributaries or creeks or rivers, wetlands, and lakes, then you can start focusing in on key species in particular. Like everybody knows that amphibians are key to wetlands health and things, creeks and things like that. You start looking at the different Diopterous species of bugs, and they tell you water quality. And so I think that those are certain aspects that we need to start making the public more aware of on how to use those type of things to determine water quality, because citizen scientists are quite valuable. Thank you.
Right. So we're gonna thank you all. We're gonna move on. Next question's for Herb, and the question is, how would you like to see data tools like the Columbia Basin Climate Source and the Columbia Basin Water Hub evolve to help overcome some of the challenges of protecting our watersheds from climate impacts? I mean, very on point in terms of what we're talking about. And, you know, are there additional, is there additional content and features that would be helpful, or, you know, are we looking at something quite different?
Okay, thank you. I think that's a very important question, because if these two sources of data are to stay really relevant, they do need to evolve, and it's what's there right now is a great start. In particular, the climate source lays out a really nice way of looking at data, both spatially across the basin, but also temporally with the estimates of climate change in the future. People can hone in on that. That's really important and needs to be applied again using the precautionary principle to what we do on the land. That climate data also can provide us with a really important piece of going forward, and that's to help us identify climate change refugia. That's a big topic that I won't digress into, but it's a really important topic that's not being carried out. In terms of the data hub, it would really benefit the data hub to have spatial mapping that shows the natural character of the system, meaning how the system functioned under indigenous management, but absent industrialized civilization, and then to also have spatial data about the current condition. What's happened to that landscape? What's the time frame over that those changes happened, and putting character and condition into the data hub spatially, along with interpretations of that data. I think it's not just the maps, but what does this mean? Why is this important? And that also can tie in with the climate data to help identify climate change refugia, which are going to become more and more important and as time goes on. And just one last point about refugia, it doesn't mean that a refugia doesn't mean that it's going to survive everything that climate change throws at us. But what people think about with refugia are from micro to macro refugia. So a micro refugia may be something that carries us forward for 10 or 15 years, with a macro refugia maybe 100 or more years.
Okay. So yeah, I think this is a whole new area, you know, an area for us to all learn about and be thinking about in terms of the refugia, knowing some have been likely been working on this for some time. Again, I open it to the panelists. Any thoughts about evolution of either of the two platforms? Like that question of, gosh, it would be really great if this platform could fill in the blank.
I'll comment really quickly. Shuswap Band has applied to the Columbia Mountain Institute, I think it was, or something like that. We wanted to develop our own information hub that housed all of the information, particularly because it's much of what we collect is Indigenous knowledge and somewhat sensitive. We were not successful at that. They thought we were too small or whatever. They never really gave us any really understanding as to why they denied us the funding. But that just opened up the doors to what we do need still. And how can we use certain areas of that hold information to the benefit of Indigenous people. One of the biggest concerns of ours is the sharing of that information and it going into the wrong hands or some culturally sensitive information being exposed and used against us. This is historically been what many refer to as the mistrust by the Indigenous people with non-Indigenous institutions. And so it's become a little, we've tried to soften that quite a bit. It's now being more vocalized by the elders, that type of concern, while we're trying to pacify it through broader understanding of how we can secure our information. And some of the stuff that we're using through the Columbia River Treaty right now and the ecosystem function work that we're doing is being housed at a certain repository and will be accessible by those Indigenous people, nations, I guess you should say, that have created that information. And so that it can be shared amongst those Indigenous nations and used in future planning exercises or whatnot we might need. I'd like to learn more about the micro and macro refugia because I think that it's a really important aspect. I thought that you were talking about geographic micro and geographic macro, but you're talking more of a timeline micro macro. And what I would like to understand is more about that. But one thing that salmon have done, and as many people know here, have made it to the Okanagan River system and have come back in quite significant numbers. And so those numbers that have come back are surprising to me. But at the same time, it's those, I guess what I'm going to call micro refugia of groundwater upwellings, of small creek and tributary inputs that have lower temperatures. And those are where those salmon are holding so that they can recover. Because if they were just migrating through that 20+ temperature water, they would not persist. And so it's those little stops of cold water refuges that are really important to understand so that we can know where they are and so that we can protect them as well. Cook's Jam.
Thanks, Mark. And for reminding us how important it is to also be focusing on the small, just as important as the big. Paris.
Thanks, Ingrid. 2 points, just wanting to build on what Herb and Mark have said. Yeah, I really appreciate the character and the interpretation, and that's partly what we're trying to do with our work. And so it's good notes for us, but also assistance with interpretation. So often that language at a local government or government level is around policy. So policy briefs. Selkirk Innovates has done a lot of that work, but I would encourage ongoing. How do we help us to understand how we can interpret and understand where the priorities are so that we can integrate it easily into our work? And again, this is a point that Herb made about actually making use of the data. And so, yeah, I would encourage that assistance at interpretation. And also just wanted to comment to Mark. I was just on a call yesterday or in a meeting with around Heritage BC, and they have lots of funding available to do that kind of work. So, and I can follow up with you later around that. But that is an important place of, yeah, protecting the cultural and what information shouldn't always be shared publicly.
Okay, and I see Herb, yeah,
last
word on this.
I just like to emphasize what Mark said about the importance of those upwellings in small streams for salmon, as well as other fish. But those upwellings are the products of small tributary watersheds and sub-watersheds to that. And it just emphasizes the point that we can't be myopic at just looking at the stream. We've got to make sure that whole watershed is taken care of if we're going to protect those upwellings.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to move to our final question, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions. So if you have any questions that you've been thinking about or prompted by what you've heard this morning, feel free to put those in the chat as we go to the last question, which is going to be for John. And that is, can you talk about any of the data that you have and what we can do with the data that we have?
Well, again, I think we've talked a lot about the data that we have and the groups that are producing that data. I really think, to summarize, I think what others have touched on, we need to keep collecting the data in the way that we're doing it through the lens that Herb talked about, that we need to collect the right data, and gratitude to all of the groups who continue to do that. I think this webinar is a great example of educating ourselves so that we can, as individuals and representatives of organizations, go out into the world with our neighbors or our work colleagues and use the data to inform decisions. And I think that's absolutely critical. And I was actually very hopeful that this whole webinar would have been in person, because I think it's great to connect in a human way with people, and hopefully we can find and create opportunities for that moving forward. I think beyond educating, we need to advocate for the use of the data, and I think that's we really see that in the work that Mark is doing. We really see that in the planning work that Herb is doing. And even in, obviously, the work that Living Lakes is doing. We've been talking about salmon restoration because it's such a bold concept that we're going to bring salmon back through an Indigenous-led process. To do that is going to take advocacy at the local level, provincial, federal, with utilities. It's mind-boggling. But as Mark has said, there's already salmon returning into the Okanagan. So we are seeing improvements, and a lot of that is ultimately connecting the data to the advocacy. That's how change is made. And I believe that advocacy is best through collaboration, by getting together groups like this. But also recognizing, as Mark has really, I think, importantly pointed out, that collaboration needs to be done in the spirit of reconciliation, understanding the sensitivity of some of the data, but also our different perspectives, and better understanding what an Indigenous-led, in the case of salmon restoration process, is going to look like. And that's not hard scientific data, that's human data. That's how we connect with each other and understand our thoughts and our beliefs.
Well said. Thank you. And so I'm going to thank all the panelists for the sharing around these questions. And I'm going to look to the chat here. I don't see, and again, if folks have a question, also you can put your hand up. Happy to take questions that way as well. I do see we have a comment here. Very much encouraged by the micro and macro refugias direction for, let's say, the Slocan watershed, allows local Indigenous and stewardship groups to ground their efforts. I'm particularly interested in understanding our mid-slope wetlands and improve our understanding how to hold and retain water. And that's from Wendy King at the Slocan Lakes Stewardship. So do we have any questions out there, further questions? This is a quiet bunch.
I just wanted to follow up on, sorry, if I can.
Yeah, well, you know what I'm going to do, Mark, is since there's no questions, is just to give an opportunity to each of you to offer some final thoughts.
Okay, great. Just first of all, I'm going to follow up on John's talk there that we just had on the data that we'd like to have. As I mentioned earlier, those cold water refuges that salmon are currently using, they are not mapped. So to know where those are, I think, is an important concept of understanding. So that would be one of my first ones to broaderly more understand as to where they are and how to protect them, or even to encourage restoration of them. And then further to model the life history of salmon that would have currently used those systems, and to try and understand how that life history model would coincide with the ability to migrate to certain areas of the Columbia, particularly all the way to the headwaters, because right now it's being looked at like the headwaters are an area that may not be achievable. And so that's some of the stuff that I need to understand more of. Protection of glaciers is another thing I need to understand more of. What efforts are being put forth right now to protect the Columbia ice fields? What efforts are available to us that we could employ? What innovative type of ideas are out there that are being currently looked at or are being tested in the world? I know that there's areas that have blanketed glaciers and things like that. Considering our climate change and the path that we're in, we are looking at losing our glaciers entirely within the next 20 to 50 years. And so that's zero availability for salmon to recover in those type of conditions. And so how do we persist salmon into past 50 years from now, so that the 7 generations that we always look at as Indigenous people can actually enjoy the bounties of what we've worked so hard to provide for them, or to restore, I should say. The Creator initially provided them, but it is my job as a salmon chief and as an Indigenous person to make sure that I do reciprocity with the Creator in what He has given us and what we give back to Him, because that is our covenant with the Creator, is to do exactly that. And I just appreciate everybody's talk and wisdom today. It takes a whole community to raise a child, and that's what I consider our river to be, is our relative and our child that we must take care of, and every component of it is part of that child. And so if you're if you're a parent, you understand what I'm talking about. And one thing I wanted to also mention is that I do an exercise quite often with people in the public, whereas I make them close their eyes and I make them do a visionary exercise. And if you would please entertain me with doing so, and you just close your eyes and listen to my words. And so you're standing on the riverbank right now. You have your son, your daughter, your grandson, your granddaughter, niece, nephew, one of those people that are very important to you, that you like to teach and have with you around the river and around the nature. And they're fishing. You're fishing with them. You've taught them how to bait their hook. You taught them how to cast. You taught them how to do all those things that they need to get the hook out there to hook onto that fish. Well, now they're catching that fish and they're reeling it in. That fish is almost to the shore, and now it's actually on shore. And that child's face is lit up with delight. What is it that's instilled in you right now? What do you feel? And that's exactly what we're missing. 365, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week as Indigenous people, is that feeling of knowledge transfer, that feeling of your people that you've taught, understanding and actually achieving that, using the knowledge that you've transferred to them to persist into the world and to become somebody different and to become themselves a knowledge transfer. And so that's what I'd like to leave you with right now, is that ability for us to transfer knowledge in the river is not only Indigenous, it's for everybody. And then that feeling that you have inside you is what you need to transfer on to the people that you're thinking of right now. So guksham to everybody for your knowledge and wisdom and time today. It has not gone unnoticed by me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for reconnecting us with what really matters. We do have a question here in terms of the final thoughts from each of the panelists. If somebody wants to answer this question and then offer their final thoughts, the question is, what does the term upwelling mean in reference to freshwater versus ocean upwelling? So you want to take that question and then follow it with your final thoughts.
I can take a stab at that. The upwelling is a broad term that means different things at different places. But I think what the examples that Mark used are referring to is two things. One, upwellings from cold groundwater that modifies the surface water temperature or lowers it, which is very important for salmon and other aquatic organisms. And the other thing that happens with upwellings is that if you have small streams, very small watersheds, watersheds that may be something in the order of even square meters instead of square kilometers, that are fully cloaked with forest and maintain low temperatures and high humidities. Those streams can actually feed into a larger stream and provide an upwelling of cold water. So those are the two primary examples of what happens with upwellings. I would also just add, in response to a comment I saw about mid-slope wetlands and climate change refugia. Those are good candidates. They're good candidates as long as we remember to protect the landscapes or the watershed around that wetland that keeps it wet and cool. You can't just draw a line around the wetland and then practice thermonuclear forestry around the rest of it and expect it to survive. So, but wetlands are a good piece of putting together networks of climate change refugia.
Oops, sorry, any final thoughts, Herb? And we'll get to
The only thing
second,
that
John.
I would encourage people is to get connected to your right brain. We need to start with heart-based thinking. And it's a good place for me to end because that's where I begin. And until we do that, we're going to continue to stumble along confusing symptoms and problems and things like that. So get in touch with your heart. I think what Mark just led us through is a good way to do that.
Thank you. John.
On that note, Herb, I think of upwelling as something that a heart does, and I would like to see upwelling as something we do as community members and people who live in this incredible part of the world. I think there needs to be an upwelling of the advocacy and use of this data for implementing the sort of plans that you're putting together and doing the sort of restoration that Mark is talking about. I'm certainly going to leave with thinking about the word upwelling. It's a good one.
All right. And Paris, final thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's what I experienced was an upwelling and the visioning that Mark led us through. And it just reminded me of the importance of being, whether in our imagination or actual being in the land and connected to water, and how important that is to make the data relevant. And so that seems like an important takeaway for my work as local government, is to encourage my colleagues to get more into the landscape and have more relationship to land and water. So thank you very much for the reminder. Yeah, and thanks very much for the connection back to heart. That was powerful and a great way to end today's session.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly something we can all take forward into the rest of our day and the days ahead as we work together on the hard issues of climate change and water. I'd like to thank, on behalf of Living Lakes Canada, Selkirk Innovates, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for being here today, all of you who came to listen and learn, wishing you all the best for the rest of your day. We'll be sending a recording of this in the coming weeks. And again, just heartfelt thanks for being here and the work we all do.